Pomerance. We are joined by Ariel Roddy. She recently graduated from Scripps College, a women's college in the Inland Empire, and she wrote a thesis entitled Price, Policy, and Purchasing: The Effects of Enforcement on Marijuana Consumption. I was fascinated by the thesis, in large part because, as you may know, the California Supreme Court recently issued a ruling that dealt with zoning laws and whether cities could exclude medical marijuana clinics. And they said on a 7-0 decision, yes. I know your thesis, though, talked more about marijuana generally and its possession, not so much about medical marijuana, but let's talk about it because marijuana is in the news. How did you come to decide to write a thesis on marijuana possession?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've always been very interested in addiction studies from a number of different angles. I think that it's mostly explored from a public health standpoint.
Sure.
I think it's also explored from a psychological standpoint. But most of my interests are in the reign of economics, and I'm really interested to see how economics plays a role in the decisions of people who are addicted or are struggling with addiction.
Right.
And I think that marijuana is also, I mean, it's really up and coming. It's also a very accessible drug. So I was really interested to see how enforcement kind of played a role in the decision making that people had.
And it's interesting you mentioned enforcement because there's no doubt that there are so many conflicting signals on enforcement. You have Washington and Colorado legalizing it.
Right.
You have California with a medical marijuana ordinance. At the same time, you have a federal government that sometimes tries to enforce its ban on the use of marijuana, period, even in California. So I'm complicating the subject even further. But let's talk about your thesis.
Absolutely.
I know you were looking at 3 specific areas. Let's kind of start with the first. If
Yeah,
you may.
absolutely. So as you said in my senior thesis, I examined 3 specific relationships.
Right.
So the first relationship that I was interested was in the relationship between enforcement. So when I say enforcement, what I'm speaking of specifically is the marijuana arrest rate.
Yes.
So I'm looking at the relationship between the marijuana arrest rate and then the street price of marijuana. So I wanted to see if any enforcement measures were going to change the price of marijuana on the street. And yeah, my results did reveal that an increase in enforcement did result in a slight increase in the street price of marijuana.
Only slight, though.
Right. I think around 50 cents per pure ounce of marijuana.
Which I think isn't a lot.
No, it's not a lot.
So what does that tell you? Or what did that tell you?
Yeah, so I think what it tells us kind of in the grander scheme of things is that these enforcement measures, although they did result in an increase in the price, they're not necessarily doing very much in terms of actually curbing the use of individuals who began to sell.
And I understand that you looked at 5 different zones throughout the country.
Yes.
Was there any distinction between geographic zones?
Yeah, there was absolutely a distinction, yes. And I think a lot of that had to do with the accessibility of marijuana in specific regions of the country. So kind of as you would assume, enforcement in California would have a very different effect than it would in a rural setting or perhaps in a central region, just because marijuana is much more accessible in here than it
is it fair to say that in rural areas where marijuana may not be so accessible, enforcement would increase the price more than on the coast, for example, where marijuana can come through Mexico or is grown everywhere in California.
Because there are fewer suppliers, obviously, in rural regions.
So what was the second part of your thesis?
The second part of my thesis involved the relationship between the price of marijuana and whether or not individuals curbed their consumption.
Interesting. And so what did you find? Was there like a break point?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a very interesting distinction between rural and non-rural settings. So in rural settings, what I found was actually that as the price increased, individuals tend to increase their use.
Increase?
Yeah, I know. How counterintuitive.
And is that because it becomes more alluring?
I mean, that could be true, but I think more or less that one of the shortcomings of my research is that I can't necessarily prove any causality between the two things that I'm examining. So one doesn't necessarily influence the other directly. I think just in the way that I did my analysis, it was difficult to know exactly whether price was influencing consumption or maybe consumption was influencing price. So as individuals began to increase consumption.
Supply and demand.
Exactly, supply and demand.
What about in non-rural settings?
In non-rural settings, actually, as the price increased, consumption decreased.
Huh.
I know, how fascinating.
Yeah.
But these were both very marginal effects. They weren't very substantial. They weren't huge, but they were significant, and they did exist.
Statistically significant.
Statistically significant, exactly.
Third part of your thesis.
Third part of my thesis, and this is kind of the crux of my interest, was to see whether or not the marijuana arrest rate, an increase in the marijuana arrest rate, had any influence over individuals using. So if they would be affected by seeing an increase in use, would they curb their consumption? And there was definitely an effect. So as the enforcement increased in these specific areas, individuals used less.
What's interesting, though, in California, we essentially have decriminalized marijuana use.
Right.
I mean, unless you're selling, you're going to get a ticket, which to me is just so odd to think. I mean, I know people who've been pulled over. They have marijuana in their possession, they get a ticket. I mean, it's worse, DWI is worse.
Right.
And so, okay, so let's step back for a second.
Yes, absolutely.
What does this tell you? You know, we have this whole notion, you know, you probably don't remember because you probably weren't born, but this whole Nancy Reagan just say no to drugs, and that continues at some level to be part of the zeitgeist in our culture, but at the same time, I mean, I was looking at some research. I mean, there are 18 states with medical marijuana laws, 3 states that are considering medical marijuana laws.
Right.
You know, as I said, Colorado and Washington have legalized it. Alaska is considering legalizing it. I mean, we're getting to a point where is prohibition just a big fat failure?
Yeah, and that's a really complicated question.
Oh, come on, you know everything. I can tell. I mean, you're a genius on this subject.
No, I mean, I can't tell you everything.
Of course.
But using the research that I've conducted, I think what we can kind of tell is that there is, in fact, a direct relationship between enforcement and consumption, and that individuals do respond to it. But specifically, from the results that I received, the system looks a little inefficient. Specifically because in order to increase, and that's what I discovered. To increase enforcement, it requires a lot of reallocation of resources in enforcement.
So while there is some causal relationship, arguably, between enforcement and decreasing rates, if you really wanted to plummet rates, you have to really send up that enforcement level.
Exactly, and that would mean substituting policemen away from maybe enforcing, like violent crimes, so trying to stop violent crimes, and then focusing more on trying to incarcerate individuals who are smoking, marijuana, and that feels a little problematic.
Did you, in your research, were you able to determine whether resources were going toward marijuana enforcement or away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the specific time period that I was interested in was a little bit after, as you said, the war on drugs.
Right.
So it was after one of the first ordinances, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which established mandatory minimum sentences for individuals who were caught with possession. And so this was kind of during a time where the war on drugs was gaining a lot of political teeth. So I specifically chose that time frame just to kind of see whether or not these specific ordinances were having an effect on the people who were consuming.
And so if you were to do part 2 of your thesis, I understand that you may be getting a PhD, God willing, what would you want to figure out next? Is there a part 4, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that because the political climate is changing so much, I would love to kind of maybe extend my thesis to a broader time frame and maybe look at specific ordinances that are going on right now. So I would love to investigate kind of the role that medical marijuana is playing kind of in the market of consumption for individuals who would use anyway.
And I wonder what happens in Washington and Colorado.
That's yet to be seen.
They have legalized, yet you still have a federal government who says it's a Schedule I drug or whatever it may be. And you also have President Obama and his administration and senators from Vermont or wherever saying, maybe we should look at this. Maybe we should allow states to resolve. So I wish you the very best. Congratulations on your graduation from Scripps College. She is Ariel Roddy. She recently wrote the thesis called Price, Policy and Purchasing, the Effects of Enforcement on Marijuana Consumption. I'm Brian Pomerance. This is Charter California Edition.